ranchers, miners, and farmers moved onto the plains, they took up the Native American line. Treaties were broken, forcing the Indians to relocate. Occasionally, the entire group would go to war against settlers and troops. The first major clash was in 1862, where the Sioux tribe in Minnesota launched an uprising. The Dakota Sioux had agreed to live in a small reservation in Minnesota. Since they moved to the reservation, the state government issued annuities. An annuity is a fixed amount of money given to someone yearly. The annuities amounted is only 5 to 30 cents an acre, and most of the money ended up in the hands of American traders. Since they would make up the stories about debts that were owed to them, they would take the annuities as payments. Congress made things worse for the Dakota Sioux tribe in 1862 by delaying the annuities. By August, the payments were a month late, and some of the tribes were starving. The same situation occurred to many other tribes. Annuities were the main reason for a loss of land for Native Americans. Native American tribes could only buy materials from government-chosen traders. Native American tribes gathered more debt and sold off more land to pay for that debt.
So, when Chief Little Crow, the leader of the Sioux tribe, asked the traders to provide food for his people on credit, a trader named Andrew Myrick replied, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." This made the chief furious. However, he reluctantly led an uprising. 2 weeks later, Myrick was found shot to death with the grass in his mouth. Little Crow really didn't want war, since they were fighting civilians, not soldiers. Hundreds died before the troops came and put a stop to it. 307 Dakota were sentenced to death for their hostilities, but President Lincoln looked through the evidence and reduced the number to 38. After the Dakota uprising, the Army sent patrols to prevent further trouble. This did stir up more hostilities. Another branch of the Sioux, the Lakota tribe, offered refuge to the Indians from Minnesota. The Lakota fought hard to keep control of their hunting grounds, which went from the Black Hills to the Bighorn Mountains. They battled those who tried to get their land. The leaders were Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. In the 1860s, tensions started to rise between the settlers and the natives. In 1863, John Bozeman blazed the Bozeman Trail, forming a route for immigrants traveling to Montana. However, that land had been reserved for the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho by the government to serve as hunting grounds in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Later, when the Colorado men murdered more than 200 peaceful Indians at Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, which we'll talk about later, the Indians began to find ways to take revenge. That they attacked whites all across the plains, including those who took the Bozeman Trail. The government responded by building a series of forts along the trail. One of the most important of those forts was Fort Phil Kearny. Indians, under the leadership of Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, began to focus on Fort Phil Kearny, harassing the soldiers and raiding their supplies. In the morning of December 21st, 1866, about 2,000 Indians hid themselves along the road north of Fort Phil Kearny. 10 decoy Indians led 80 American troops and Colonel William Fetterman away from Fort Phil Kearny. The troops were then ambushed by 2,000 Indians, and this was the worst defeat for the American troops before the Battle of Little Bighorn, with 81 fatalities.
The battle that she talked about came to be known as Fetterman's Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre occurred on November 29, 1864, 2 days before Fetterman's Massacre, when Colonel John Chivington and his Colorado volunteers went against orders and massacred peaceful Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Indian tribe in Sand Creek, Colorado. 148 Native Americans were slaughtered and 9 Colorado volunteers died. The act was first praised by white Americans, but when the circumstances emerged, they were criticized.
Many other incidents like this, which led to Congress deciding that something drastic needed to be done. In 1867, Congress formed an Indian Peace Commission which proposed that there would be 2 large reservations. One would be for the Sioux, and the other would be for the Southern Plain Indians. This plan was a failure. The Peace Commission actually did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It caused even more of a rift between the Native Americans and the new white Americans. The chiefs were pressured into signing the treaties. The same corrupt ways of the American traders were still practiced. In the 1870s, many Indians left the area in disgust and tried to continue hunting buffalo in the open plains. However, the buffalo were rapidly disappearing since other migrants had killed them. After the Civil War, hunters killed the animal for their hide and sold it. Some railroad hunters hired people to shoot the buffalo down since they were obstructing rail traffic. By 1889, very few of them were left.
In 1876,
fortune hunters invaded the Lakota Sioux territory to mine gold. The Lakota Sioux didn't see a reason to follow the treaty that the Americans were violating. Many of them left the reservation to the Bighorn Mountains. The government responded by sending George A. Custer and General Alfred H. Terry on an expedition. George A. Custer was born in News Rumley, Ohio in 1839. He went up against the Native Americans in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He underestimated the abilities and troops of the Indians. The Battle of Little Bighorn was fought on June 25, 1876 in Montana, near Little Bighorn River, and was the biggest U.S. defeat against the Native Americans. Part of the U.S. Army was dispatched to handle a group of NA tribes who were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer and his 7th Cavalry were sent to scout ahead for enemy troops. Custer reached the camp on June 25th and decided to attack instead of waiting for reinforcements in broad daylight. The tribes were alerted of the impending attack and sent Crazy Horse and around 3,000 men to fend off Custer's 200 soldiers. The battle lasted an hour, and Custer and all his men died in what was known as Custer's Last Stand. White Americans were outraged, and Indians were confirmed as bloodthirsty savages in this battle. And this is a map of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And the blue/purple are the U.S. Army movements, while the red is the Indian movements. And these are these red teepees are the Indian lands. And this is the Little Bighorn River.
Some Americans had opposed the treatment of Native Americans for a long time. Some people believed that the situation would only improve if the Indians could assimilate or be absorbed into American society as landowners and citizens. At first, many treaties with Indian tribes stated that land would be divided among individual tribe members. After 1871, Congress declared that there would be no such treaties, and all future dealings with Indian nations would be done so through legislation. Even though Congress passed a couple of acts that allotted land on specific Indian reservations, it wasn't really put into action. To assimilate into American society, that meant breaking up reservations into allotments where families could settle and support themselves. The policy for assimilation became a law in Dawes Act. This turned the Native Americans into citizens. The head of household received reservation land for farming. Adults got 80 acres and children got 40. The land that was left after the Native Americans got their allotments was sold to American settlers. All the proceeds went to a trust for Native Americans. Though the plan was well thought out, Native Americans had little success in becoming farmers and ranchers. The Indians found their allotments to be too small to be profitable. Some sold their land. In the end, no legislation was a good solution to the Indians. The Plains Indians were doomed because there was no buffalo, so there was no clothing, fuel, food, or shelter. When herds were wiped out, the tribes had no way to survive, other than adopting the American way of life.
Wait, did you get me getting this sleepy eye out of my mouth?
It's got allotments. We're so Adriana!
I think it